It happened so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. The small, stinging sound of skin meeting skin, the sharp smack that silenced the clatter of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator. My grandson, Ethan, looked up at me with wide eyes, his lips trembling between fear and pride. He couldn't have been more than 6. My cheek burned, but it wasn't the pain that took my breath away, it was the laughter that followed. My son, Daniel, my only child, chuckled softly as he poured himself another cup of coffee. "He's only playing, Mom," he said, his voice thick with amusement. And then came Claire, my daughter-in-law. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect disdain. She didn't even look up from her phone when she said, "Maybe don't tell him what to do next time." The air shifted. The warmth that had once filled Daniel's kitchen felt suddenly cold, sterile, like a stranger's house. I tried to smile, to brush it off. "It's okay, honey," I whispered to Ethan, my hand trembling as I touched my cheek. "Just don't do that again." But inside, something cracked, something old, something fragile that had already been wearing thin. That night, as I sat in the small guest room, once Daniel's childhood bedroom, I stared at the framed photos on the dresser. Him in his graduation gown, the proud mother beside him. Him on his wedding day, my late husband Robert's tie around his neck. Memories that used to taste sweet now felt bitter, like dust in my mouth. Through the thin walls, I could hear them talking. Claire's voice sharp, Daniel's tired. "She's always correcting him. It's confusing." "She's just old-fashioned," Daniel said. "She means well." "Well, maybe she can mean well somewhere else. She's been here almost a year, Dan." I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they might hear it through the walls. Almost a year. They were counting. I pressed my hand to my mouth and swallowed the sound of my breathing. That was when I realized I wasn't really family anymore. I was a guest who had stayed too long. When the house went quiet again, I opened the small drawer of the nightstand. Inside were a few of my things, an old silver hairbrush, Robert's watch, and the perfume bottle Daniel had given me on my 60th birthday. The scent was faint now, barely there, just like me. I lifted it, sprayed once into the air. The fragrance lingered, soft, floral, ghost-like. I watched it drift upward and fade. And in that fading, I saw myself, disappearing one quiet moment at a time. The next morning, I made breakfast early, before anyone else was awake. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee just the way Daniel liked it. I set the table neatly, like I used to when he was little. When he came downstairs, he smiled politely. "You didn't have to do that, Mom." "I wanted to," I said. "But what I meant was, I need to feel useful. I need to feel like I belong." Claire came in next, her silk robe sweeping the floor, her eyes barely glancing at me. "You're up early." I smiled. "Habit, I suppose." She poured her own coffee, not from the pot I made, and muttered, "We'll be out most of the day. Ethan has a playdate." And just like that, I was invisible again. After they left, the house was silent. I sat by the window, the winter light pooling on the floor, and thought of Robert. He would have known what to say. He always did. He'd touch my hand and remind me that kindness wasn't weakness. But kindness, I was learning, could also be a leash. I looked around at their home. The sleek furniture, the muted colors, the walls that held none of my pictures. Not one photograph of me. There used to be one, Daniel as a boy, me holding him in the garden, his arms around my neck. It had been in the hallway for years. Now it was gone. I wondered if Claire had put it away, or thrown it out. That night, as I folded my laundry in silence, I noticed a drawing on the counter, Ethan's, from school. A stick-figure family, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small boy between them. Underneath, in crooked letters, he'd written Mom, Dad, and me. No Grandma. I stared at it for a long time. I knew children drew what they saw, what they felt. And in his eyes, maybe I wasn't part of the picture anymore. Something inside me began to ache, not like a wound, but like a slow death. Later that week, I found my favorite mug, the one Robert had given me with the words, "Best Mom Ever," pushed to the back of the cabinet, chipped at the rim. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the rough edge against my skin. A tiny imperfection, easy to ignore, until it cut you. That was how it felt. Small things, over time, slicing into me until I bled in ways no one could see. And yet, I said nothing. Because what do you say to your son when you realize he's forgotten who you are? When your voice no longer carries weight in the home you helped him build? That night, I dreamed of the old house, the one Robert and I had shared. The smell of roses from my garden. The laughter echoing down the hallway. When I woke, tears clung to my lashes. I whispered into the dark, "I just want to go home." But home, I knew, wasn't a place anymore. It was a memory. And memories couldn't keep you warm. When Ethan came running into my room the next morning, waving a toy sword, I smiled despite myself. "Good morning, sweetheart." He laughed and swung the plastic blade. "You're the bad guy, Grandma." "Am I?" I asked softly. He nodded with playful seriousness. "Daddy says you always make rules." And there it was, the echo of his father's voice, trickling down to the next generation. When he swung again, his sword hit my arm harder than he meant. It didn't hurt much, but I caught his wrist gently and said, "Be careful, honey. That's not nice." He frowned. And before I could blink, his hand flew again, a slap, quick and thoughtless, straight across my cheek. I gasped. His little eyes widened, not with guilt, but confusion, as if he'd only done what he'd been taught. From the doorway, I heard Daniel's voice. "What's going on?" I turned, expecting comfort, support, anything, but he only laughed, the same way he had before. "He's just a kid, Mom." Claire appeared beside him, arms folded. "Maybe you should stop correcting him. He's not used to that tone." As if the problem wasn't the slap, but my reaction to it. I stood there, my heart pounding, my cheeks stinging, my pride dissolving. And for the first time, I didn't apologize. I didn't smile or say it was fine. I just walked away. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the small suitcase tucked under it, the one I'd never unpacked completely. I reached for my perfume again, that fading scent of who I used to be, and sprayed it once more into the empty air. The mist hung there for a moment, delicate, defiant, before it disappeared. And as it did, I whispered to myself, maybe it's time I disappear too. Before all of this, before the quiet humiliation and the locked doors, I was someone else. Someone I almost can't remember now. I used to be Maggie. That's what Robert called me. He'd say it softly, like a secret. Maggie, my heart. Even after 30 years, he never stopped saying it that way. We lived in a small brick house on Linden Street, nothing fancy, but every inch of it was ours. Robert built the porch swing himself. I planted roses out front. Every Sunday, I'd make pancakes while he read the paper, and Daniel, my sweet, freckled boy, would beg to lick the batter from the bowl. It was the kind of ordinary happiness you don't realize is rare until it's gone. When Robert died, a heart attack in his sleep, it felt as if someone had pulled the color out of the world. I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, staring at his coffee mug still on the counter. There was a ring of dried milk around the rim, and it hit me then, how many invisible things we leave behind. Daniel came home for the funeral, holding Claire's hand. She was so composed, so effortlessly beautiful. I remember thinking she was everything my son deserved. I didn't know then that her smile was a mask, or that behind those perfect eyes lived something sharp. A few weeks later, Daniel said softly, "Mom, you shouldn't be alone. We've got the space now. Come live with us. Just until you get used to things." It sounded like love. It was love at first. I sold the house, packed up 30 years of life into a handful of boxes, photos, a few books, Robert's watch, my favorite teacup, and the perfume bottle that still smelled faintly of lilacs. When I handed the keys to the new owners, I cried all the way to Daniel's. At first, living with them felt safe. Claire was polite enough. Ethan was just a baby then, and I loved helping, changing diapers, singing him to sleep, giving Daniel and Claire a chance to rest. I'd sit in the rocking chair in the nursery, the same lullabies I'd sung to Daniel spilling from my lips. Sometimes I'd look at Ethan's tiny face and whisper, "You're my second chance at joy." But time has a way of warping things. As Ethan grew, Claire began to change. She'd watch me too closely when I cooked, as if I were intruding in her kitchen. When I folded laundry, she'd refold it after me. I started to notice little comments, "Oh, that's how you do it," or "My mother taught me differently." They were small, but sharp enough to draw blood. I tried to ignore them. I told myself she was just particular, that she was stressed, that I could make her like me if I just tried a little harder. But I began to notice other things, too. The way Daniel's tone shifted when he spoke to her, careful, subdued. The way she'd sigh when I entered the room, as though I were the draft that blew out her candle. One day, while I was cleaning the kitchen, I found a box tucked behind the cereal. Inside were the framed photos that used to hang in the hallway, Robert and me, Daniel's graduation, our first Christmas as a family. Every one of them had been replaced with new ones, Claire's family, her friends, her parents. I remember holding one of the old photos in my hands, Daniel as a child, sitting on Robert's shoulders, both of them smiling at me. There was a small crack in the glass where my face had been. When I asked Daniel about it that night, he looked uncomfortable. "Claire just wanted to redecorate," he said. "You know how she is." I laughed softly, trying to hide the sting. Of course. It's her home. But that night, when I went to bed, I cried into my pillow until it was damp. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd go through the small box of things I'd kept from my old house. Robert's watch, still ticking faintly. Our wedding ring set. The dried rose from our garden. I'd run my fingers over them like I was touching the ghosts of my own life. Those objects became my anchors, the only proof that I had once been someone loved, someone chosen. Months passed, and my world kept shrinking. I stopped inviting old friends over because Claire said it made her anxious. I stopped wearing perfume because Ethan said it smelled weird. I stopped playing my favorite music in the mornings because Daniel liked silence. Every small surrender felt temporary, until I realized they'd become permanent. And yet, I told myself it was fine. That families adapt. That love requires compromise. But love, real love, doesn't erase you. One afternoon, I was folding Ethan's clothes when I heard Claire on the phone in the next room. "She's harmless," she said, laughing softly. "Just old. She means well, but she's always in the way. Dan won't ask her to leave, so I guess we're stuck with her for now." Her words sliced through me like glass. Stuck with her. I sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching one of Ethan's tiny shirts to my chest, the cotton damp from my tears. For the first time, I let myself admit something I'd been denying for months. They didn't love me here. I was tolerated. An inconvenience disguised as family. That night, when Daniel came home, I asked softly, "Do you ever miss your father?" He hesitated. "Of course. I do too," I said. "Sometimes I think about how much he'd love to see you now, how proud he'd be of the man you've become." He smiled faintly. "Yeah." But when his phone buzzed, he checked it immediately, Claire's name lighting up the screen. "I have to take this, Mom," he said, walking away. I watched him go, and it struck me, even my memories of him were slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I poured myself a cup of tea and stared out the window. The moon hung low, pale and distant, a coin lost in the sky. I thought of Robert again, of the night he proposed under the old oak tree. He'd said, "Home isn't walls, Maggie. It's the person who waits for you there." But there was no one waiting for me anymore. Only silence. And still, I stayed. I told myself I was doing it for Daniel, for Ethan, that leaving would be selfish. But the truth was simpler, sadder. I was afraid. Afraid of starting over at my age. Afraid of being truly alone. I didn't realize it then, but that fear was exactly what kept me trapped, what made me swallow every insult, ignore every bruise to my pride, pretend every laugh at my expense didn't hurt. It wasn't until that Sunday morning, when Ethan's tiny hand struck my face and Daniel just laughed, that the illusion finally shattered. That slap wasn't just a child's misbehavior. It was a mirror, showing me exactly what I'd allowed myself to become. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It began quietly, the way most endings do, not with an explosion, but a slow, steady erosion of warmth. I started noticing how often the living room lights were off when I came downstairs, how the curtains were drawn before I'd even finished dinner, how Daniel and Claire began to whisper in corners, their laughter low and private, the laughter that used to include me. At first, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired, sensitive. But the truth had a way of making itself known, even through the cracks of denial. One evening, I came into the kitchen to find my dinner plate already in the sink. Claire stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone, her glass of wine half empty. "Oh," I said softly, forcing a smile. "Did I miss dinner?" She didn't look up. "We ate early." Daniel appeared behind her, avoiding my eyes. "We didn't think you were hungry, Mom." My voice trembled. "I was in my room. You could have called me." Claire sighed, the way one might sigh at a child. "It's just easier this way sometimes. You have your own snacks, don't you?" Something in her tone, that light, pitying tone, made my stomach twist. After they left the kitchen, I stood there, staring at the empty plate in the sink. There was still a bit of food stuck to it, mashed potatoes, a streak of gravy, evidence of a meal I hadn't been invited to. I turned off the lights and went upstairs, my steps quiet, careful. I didn't want to disturb anyone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the muffled sound of their television downstairs. A sitcom. Laughter. Every burst of it felt like a reminder of how far away I'd drifted. At one point, I thought about leaving. I imagined walking down the street in my old coat, suitcase in hand, catching the late bus to anywhere. But where would I go? My old house was gone. My friends, scattered, or too polite to ask why I never visited anymore. I had built my world around Daniel and his family, and now I realized I had built it on sand. The next afternoon, it happened. I had gone out for a short walk, needing air. The winter wind bit through my coat, the sky the color of tin. I stopped at a small park bench and sat there for a while, watching the bare trees sway. Children played in the distance, their laughter light, innocent. When I finally returned, the sun was setting. The porch light was off. The house looked different, too quiet. I tried the door. It didn't budge. Locked. I frowned and knocked lightly. No answer. I rang the bell, the sound echoing into the stillness. Through the window, I saw them, Daniel, Claire, and Ethan, sitting at the dinner table. Candles lit. Plates full. Laughing. My heart stuttered. I knocked again, harder this time. Claire looked up, her expression flickering, irritation, then something colder. She said something to Daniel. He hesitated, then came to the door and cracked it open an inch. "Mom," he said softly, "we thought you were staying with your friend tonight." I blinked. "What?" "I don't have any friends here." Claire's voice floated from behind him. "Maybe you should make some." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted. Absurd. Surreal. You locked me out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, it's not like that. We need space, okay? Things have been tense. Claire feels uncomfortable sometimes. Uncomfortable, I repeated. In her own house? Or in mine? He flinched. Don't do that. You know what I mean. I could see Ethan peeking from the table, wide-eyed, confused. My grandson, watching me stand in the cold, like a stranger on his doorstep. The humiliation was complete. Please, I said softly. Just open the door. After a long silence, he did. But only halfway. Enough for me to slip through, enough to make me feel like an intruder in the home I'd once thought of as family. Dinner went on without me. I sat upstairs in my small room, listening to the clinking of silverware below, the faint laughter, the scrape of chairs. I thought of Robert then, how he used to say, "You can't stay where you're unloved, Maggie. It turns your soul into dust." And I wondered, had my soul already turned? When the house grew quiet, I went to the window. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the world outside in a fragile, temporary beauty. It was the kind of night that should have felt magical. But all I felt was the weight of being unwanted. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands, wrinkled, trembling slightly. They didn't look like mine anymore. I reached for my small jewelry box, the one that held Robert's watch and our wedding rings. I turned his ring over in my palm, tracing the tiny engraving inside, "Always yours." The metal was cold, almost cruel in its honesty. I thought about Daniel's words earlier. We need space. Space. I'd given him my whole world, my love, my years, my patience. What more space could he need? Then I remembered Claire's eyes when she said, "Maybe you should make some friends." The disdain there wasn't subtle. It was final. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not a snap, not a scream, but a quiet, definitive click. I realized I was living in a house where even love had locks. I didn't cry that night. I thought I would, but I didn't. My tears had dried into something else, something heavier, like resolve. I began to pack a small bag, just enough for a few days. My old coat, my wallet, my journal, the perfume bottle, and Robert's watch. I placed the rings inside the box, closed it, and whispered, "Not here. Not anymore." When dawn came, I sat on the bed, watching the first light creep across the floor. I heard Ethan's little footsteps outside my door, his voice bright. "Daddy, where's Grandma?" Daniel's answer was faint. "She needs some time away." I smiled sadly. He wasn't wrong. Later that morning, when the house was empty, I walked to the mirror. My reflection startled me. There was no anger there, just a kind of quiet exhaustion that looked too much like surrender. I touched my cheek, still remembering the phantom burn of that slap. I whispered to the woman staring back at me, "You've given them everything. Now it's time to give something to yourself." I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I closed the door behind me, I left the note on the kitchen counter. Short, neat, final. "Thank you for the time I spent here. Take care." I didn't sign it, Mom. The sound of the door clicking shut behind me was the softest sound in the world, and the loudest goodbye I'd ever said. For the first time in years, I stepped into the cold morning air and didn't look back. My heart was breaking, but beneath the cracks, a strange new strength was forming. A whisper that said, "You are not done yet." The bus ride to the coast took 5 hours. I sat by the window, the hum of the engine lulling my thoughts into a slow, steady rhythm. Outside, the landscape shifted from city gray to the muted greens of distant hills, then finally to the faded blue line of the sea. It had been years since I'd seen the ocean. When I was young, Robert used to drive us to a small seaside town every summer. We'd eat fish and chips by the pier and let Daniel chase the gulls. Back then, the sea meant freedom. Now it felt like a refuge, the last place left where I could disappear quietly. The cottage I rented was small and weathered, perched on a gentle slope overlooking the water. The paint was peeling, the steps creaked, and the windows rattled when the wind blew, but it was mine. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing in the salt air, the faint scent of damp wood and seaweed. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something close to peace. The first few days passed in silence. I cooked simple meals, toast, tea, soup, and walked along the shore, collecting shells I didn't need. The waves moved in their slow, eternal rhythm, whispering stories I was finally quiet enough to hear. At night, I wrote long, rambling entries in my old leather journal, things I'd never dared say out loud. About Daniel. About Claire. About the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit into the narrow spaces they allowed me. Sometimes I'd light Robert's old watch beside me, listening to its steady tick, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I kept his ring on the windowsill, where the moonlight could touch it. It became my ritual, a small altar to everything I'd lost. But grief, I learned, has stages, and silence was only the first. One afternoon, as I sat on the beach with a thermos of coffee, I saw a small group of women nearby, laughing, sketching, collecting driftwood. They were artists from a nearby community center. One of them, a woman named Helen, noticed me and waved. "Beautiful spot, isn't it?" she called out. I smiled politely. "It is." She walked over, her boots crunching on the pebbles. "You staying here for long?" "Just figuring that out," I said. Helen grinned. "Well, if you get bored of solitude, we have a little art class on Wednesdays. Nothing serious. Just paint, talk, drink bad coffee. You look like someone who could use company that doesn't come with drama." Her words hit closer than she knew. I promised I'd stop by sometime. That night, I looked at my reflection in the cottage mirror. My hair had grown wilder in the sea wind. My face was softer, but my eyes, they were changing. There was something there now, something steady and dangerous. I wasn't sure if it was healing or awakening. The following Wednesday, I joined Helen's group. We painted still lives, apples, bottles, flowers. But my canvas became something else entirely. My hand moved on instinct, shaping colors into a dark silhouette, a woman standing by a burning window, her back turned to the flames. Helen came over, peering at it with fascination. "That's powerful," she murmured. "What's her story?" I smiled faintly. "She's realizing she doesn't have to burn with the house." They laughed lightly, but I didn't. Each stroke felt like a release. Every line of color was a small rebellion against the silence I'd lived in. I started going every week. Slowly, I began to feel human again, not just a shadow in someone else's home. Weeks turned into months. The cottage began to feel like mine, every chipped mug, every creaking floorboard. I grew used to the rhythm of the tides, the gulls calling at dawn, the soft hiss of rain against the windows. But peace has a way of uncovering the anger that silence hides. One night, I was sorting through my things and found an envelope I didn't recognize. Inside were photographs, family pictures Claire had packed by mistake, I guessed. Daniel, Claire, and Ethan on Christmas morning. My chair was empty in the corner. I stared at that image for a long time. My grandson was growing, smiling, living a life that no longer included me. And Daniel, he looked content, unburdened. As if my existence had been a weight he'd been glad to set down. That night, I didn't sleep. The sea roared outside, wild and restless, mirroring something inside me. I went to the window, my reflection barely visible in the glass. The moonlight shimmered on the waves, turning them into veins of silver. For the first time since I'd arrived, I whispered his name out loud. "Daniel." It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. not of vengeance in the cruel sense, but of reckoning. A quiet, deliberate reclaiming of everything they had tried to erase. I began to plan. Not to hurt him, but to remind him. To remind all of them that I was still here. That you cannot bury a mother's love under convenience and shame. I reached out to an old friend from Robert's law firm, a kind man named Paul who'd always admired Robert's integrity. I asked him to help me with something practical, transferring my savings into my own name, finalizing the deed to the cottage, and, most importantly, setting up a trust. A trust for Ethan. Paul was surprised. You sure, Maggie? You don't owe them a thing after what they did. I'm not doing it for them, I said softly. I'm doing it for the only one who never chose sides. When the paperwork was done, I sat on the porch watching the sea. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and pine. My heart was steady now. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my story. In the months that followed, I began selling small paintings at local fairs, landscapes, seascapes, and sometimes that same recurring figure, the woman by the burning window. People loved her. They said she looked strong, unafraid. I smiled every time someone said that. They didn't know she was me. The local papers even wrote a small feature about the widow by the sea who paints with sorrow and salt. I laughed when I read that. It was dramatic, but maybe not wrong. Then, one spring afternoon, I received a letter. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Daniel's. My hands shook as I opened it. Mom, I heard you've moved near the coast. Ethan misses you. I wanted to visit, but Claire thinks it's too soon. I hope you're doing okay. I'm sorry for how things ended. I wish I'd handled it better. If you're open to it, maybe we can talk someday. Love. Daniel. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it between the pages of my journal. For the first time, I didn't cry. Because I realized something. I didn't need an apology to heal. I had already done it myself. The sea had taught me something that no house, no husband, no son ever had. That peace isn't given. It's built. And mine was just beginning to take shape. That night, I went for a walk along the beach. The wind tugged at my coat, the stars glittered like small mercies above. I carried Robert's watch in my pocket, feeling its soft tick against my palm. The tide washed over my feet, cold, bracing, alive. I looked out toward the endless dark horizon and whispered, "You were right, Robert. I can't stay where I'm unloved. But I can build where I'm free." And somewhere between the roar of the waves and the echo of my heartbeat, I felt it, that first spark of quiet revenge. Not the kind that destroys. The kind that rebuilds. The kind that lives well, visibly, defiantly, until the people who left you realize they didn't break you at all. The kind of revenge that doesn't need witnesses, because the sea is enough. It's strange how, when you stop trying to prove your worth, the world starts to notice you. By autumn, the coastal town felt less like a hiding place and more like home. My paintings had begun to sell regularly. Helen and I even held a small gallery show in a renovated boathouse. The local paper called it The Art of Solitude. I smiled when I saw the headline, because that's exactly what I'd been learning. Solitude wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space. Space to remember who I had been before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. That night at the gallery, people came and went, sipping wine, murmuring polite admiration. But one painting drew the most attention, The Window That Burned. A woman's silhouette against firelight, her face turned toward the sea. A journalist asked if it was symbolic. I said, yes, it's about surviving the fire and realizing you were never the one who set it. He nodded thoughtfully. It feels redemptive. It is, I replied softly. After everyone left, I sat alone in the quiet room, surrounded by my work. Each piece told a part of my story: grief, loss, rage, release, until, finally, peace. And I realized that what I had created wasn't just art. It was evidence, a record of rebirth. Still, every so often, Daniel's letter would find its way back into my thoughts. He wanted to visit, to talk, but I wasn't ready. Forgiveness was not a doorway I could open just because he knocked. It was something I had to build brick by brick, in my own time. One stormy night in late October, the phone rang. It was Paul, my late husband's old colleague, the one who'd helped me set up the trust for Ethan. "Maggie," he said gently, "I thought you should know, the firm's merger went through. Robert's name is still on the foundation documents. There's a bit of legacy funding attached, and I thought maybe you'd like to make the first donation." "To what kind of cause?" I asked. "Anything you'd like. It's in your name now." For a long moment, I didn't speak. Then I said, I wanted to go toward art therapy programs, for women rebuilding their lives. Maybe people like me. Paul chuckled softly. Robert would have liked that. Turning pain into something useful. I smiled through a quiet ache. So do I. After we hung up, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks like applause. Somewhere deep inside me, I felt Robert's calm approval, as if, finally, the version of me he'd loved was coming back to life. In November, Helen convinced me to teach a weekend workshop at the art center. At first, I refused. "I'm no teacher," I told her. She grinned. "You're not teaching art, Maggie. You're teaching survival with paintbrushes." That weekend, 6 women showed up, all different ages, all carrying invisible bruises. Some had been left, some betrayed, some broken. We painted in silence for hours. Then one woman, a soft-spoken nurse named Lydia, asked, "How did you stop being angry?" I set my brush down, thinking carefully. "I didn't stop," I said. "I just started building something stronger than anger." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'd like to learn that." I smiled. "Then start with color. Let it hurt. Let it heal. The canvas doesn't judge." By the end of the weekend, the room was filled with wild, beautiful, imperfect paintings and laughter. For the first time since I'd arrived at the sea, I wasn't alone in my healing. I was part of something bigger, a small circle of women daring to remake themselves. That night, as I washed the paint from my hands, I noticed how steady they'd become. No tremor. No hesitation. Just quiet strength. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast, I saw a familiar car pull into the drive. Dark gray, clean, expensive. My stomach tightened. Daniel. He stepped out slowly, looking older than I remembered, a few gray strands, deeper lines around his eyes. He held a bouquet of lilies, my favorite. For a long time, he just stood there, unsure if he should come closer. I met him at the door. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. I didn't hug him. I didn't invite him in right away. But I didn't shut the door, either. He looked around, taking in the cottage, the sea, the paintings visible through the window. "You've made a life here." "I have," I said. He exhaled. "You look happy. Better." "I am." There was silence, the kind that hums with unspoken apologies. Then he said, "I was a coward. I let Claire's anger become mine. It was easier to blame you than to face her." I looked him in the eye. "You let your son hit me, Daniel. And you laughed." He flinched, tears rising. "I know. God, I know. I think about that every day." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. For a moment, he looked like a lost boy again. My boy. And I realized I could pity him without absolving him. "Come in," I said finally. "For tea." "That's all." He followed me inside. As I poured the tea, he noticed the watch on the table, Robert's old one. He touched it gently. I remember this. He wore it every day, I said. He was a better man than me, Daniel whispered. Different, I replied. But you still have time. We drank in silence, the air between us heavy with years. When he left, he hugged me, tentative, fragile. I didn't say, I forgive you. But I didn't turn away, either. After he drove off, I stood by the window for a long while. The sea was calm that day. I touched the watch, feeling its faint ticking. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning how to carry the memory without letting it poison you. Weeks passed. Letters started arriving again, this time from Ethan. Childlike handwriting, full of questions and drawings. Grandma, do you have a dog? Grandma, can I visit the sea? Every letter made me smile and ache. Then, one morning, a small package arrived. Inside was a photograph, Ethan on a school stage, wearing a paper crown. On the back, Daniel had written, "He asked me to send this. He wanted you to see him as a king." I laughed softly, tears stinging my eyes. My grandson, the little boy who once slapped me, was now growing into someone kind, someone who could still be taught. The next week, I replied, "Dear Ethan, I have no dog, but I do have a seagull that visits me every morning. I named him Braveheart. You can meet him if you come visit someday." By spring, my workshop had grown into a small foundation, funded partly by Robert's legacy and my own art sales. We called it the Lighthouse Project. Our motto was simple: you are allowed to begin again. One evening, Helen and I watched the sunset from the beach, the horizon a blaze of gold and rose. "You've changed," she said softly. "When I first met you, you looked like you were made of broken glass. Now you look luminous." I smiled. "Maybe I am. Broken glass can still catch the light." She laughed. "You should paint that." "I already am," I said. "In everything I do." That night, I walked barefoot along the shore. The sand was cool, the tide gentle. The moon floated low and white above the water. I felt Robert beside me, Daniel in the distance, Ethan's laughter echoing faintly in my memory. I realized that revenge, the kind I once dreamed of, was small. This was something greater, not the destruction of those who wronged me, but the creation of a life so full, so undeniable, that it made their cruelty irrelevant. I had not simply survived. I had become. And the woman standing by the burning window in my paintings? She wasn't turning away anymore. She was stepping through the fire. When I returned to the city, the air felt heavier than I remembered, the kind of weight that sits between silence and memory. It had been 3 years since I'd walked those streets. 3 years since I'd seen the house that once held my laughter, my meals, my small place in the world. Now, I stood before it again. The same white fence, though the paint was chipped and the flowers were gone. I wondered if they'd ever noticed how empty it looked without me tending it. I wasn't there to reclaim anything. I'd stopped belonging to that house long ago. I came only to close a door properly, one I had once been thrown out of. My son, Daniel, opened the door after a few knocks. He froze when he saw me. His eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite guilt, but not comfort either, like a man seeing a ghost he never meant to summon. "Mom," he said softly, as if the word might break. "Daniel," I replied, steady. "I didn't come to stay. I just came to talk." He stepped aside. The living room looked smaller, colder. The photos on the wall were new. None of me, of course. But there was one of my grandson, Mason, in his school uniform. He looked older now, taller. My heart ached, but not the same way it used to. I sat on the same couch where, years ago, I'd been humiliated. The memory of his laughter still hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. My daughter-in-law, Grace, entered from the kitchen. She stopped short, drying her hands with a towel, her lips tightening into that same condescending smile she used to wear like armor. "Well," she said, "this is a surprise." I nodded slightly. "I'm not here to argue. Just to say what I need to say, and then I'll be gone." Grace shrugged, leaning on the counter. Daniel looked uncomfortable, caught between curiosity and shame. I turned to him. "You once told me family means understanding. I believed you. I gave up my pride, my comfort, and years of my life helping you. And when your son hit me, you laughed." That laugh, Daniel, it wasn't just noise. It was the sound of every sacrifice I ever made cracking in half. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Grace folded her arms. "He's a child," she muttered. "No," I said quietly. "He was a reflection. Children mirror what they see." The words hung there, simple but heavy. For the first time, Daniel looked at Grace, not me. The silence between them said more than I ever could. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. "These are some old family photos. I thought Mason might want them someday, when he's old enough to understand where he comes from. When he's ready to know the truth about kindness and respect." Grace frowned. "What truth?" I looked her in the eye, and for once, she looked away first. "That love isn't something you control. It's something you earn." I stood up slowly, my body older but my spirit steady. "You don't have to like me, Grace, but you should thank me, because the woman you tried to break, she learned how to live without you." Daniel finally spoke, voice trembling. "Mom, I didn't mean." I raised a hand gently. "I know. You didn't mean to become like your father. You didn't mean to hurt me. But meaning and doing are not the same. I forgave you a long time ago. Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me." He lowered his head, and for a second, I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to bring me wildflowers and say, "Don't ever be sad, Mom." I walked to the door, paused, and turned once more. "Take care of him," I said softly. "Teach him better." Then I left. Outside, the sky had turned the color of faded lavender, a calm evening wind brushing my hair. Across the street, children were playing. Their laughter didn't sting anymore. It felt like a song from another lifetime. I walked to the small car I'd bought with the savings from selling my seaside cottage. That home had been my sanctuary, the place I rebuilt myself, brushstroke by brushstroke, tear by tear. I'd painted sunsets and silence until peace felt like muscle memory. As I drove away, I didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry for. My revenge had never been about making them suffer. It was about living well enough that their cruelty could no longer define me. At a red light, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my reflection. My hair was streaked with silver now, my eyes softer but stronger. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I was free. When I reached the coast that night, the sea greeted me like an old friend. I sat by the water with a cup of tea, the same way I had the night I first ran from that house. Only this time, I wasn't running. I was home. The moonlight shimmered across the waves, and I thought of Mason. I hoped one day, he'd grow into the kind of man who understood the weight of a woman's silence. Maybe, someday, he'd come find me. I took off my old wedding ring, the one I'd worn long after love had died, and placed it on the shore. The tide slowly carried it away, swallowing years of pain in its silver mouth. "Goodbye," I whispered, not to them, but to the woman I used to be. Then I turned toward my small seaside cottage, its windows glowing with warm light, and smiled. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's mother, someone's wife, or someone's burden. I was simply me, and that was the sweetest revenge of all.